Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's seminar on net community benefit. My name is Matt Gilbertson, and I will be one of your hosts today, along with John Glossop. And the purpose of today's webinar is to talk to you around that term that sits in the operational provisions of our planning scheme, net community benefit, and something that we're all required to assess in decision making. So in today's presentation, John and I are going to walk you through the context for net community benefit and then how it's been applied in decision making and how to move towards a better consideration of net community benefit in decision making. As I touched on, my name's Matt Gilbertson and I'm a Senior Associate at Glossop Town Planning. I'm also a sessional lecturer and tutor in statutory planning at RMIT University in the Masters program. I'm joined today by John Glossop, and I'll get John to introduce himself.
Thanks, Matt. Morning, everybody. I help Matt out in the RMIT program as well. Matt does all the hard work and I do a couple of the lectures. And in addition to that, I'm Director at Glossop Town Planning and the founder of ADDO. Started my career as a planner back in, 1994 as a planner at the Shire of Newham and Woodend, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's now up in the Macedon Ranges. Then I was the strategic planning manager for the Melton Shire Council, and I left that organisation in about 1997 to start up GTP. I've been there ever since. Since then, I've been a sessional member of Planning Panels Victoria, which was a wonderful opportunity and a real privilege to be part of that incredible team there. And since in my role at GTP, both a statutory and strategic planner, and one of the things I like doing most really is drafting planning controls and planning policy, and in particular implementing strategic planning projects through the planning scheme. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, John. The way we're going to run today's webinar is we're going to talk a little bit at the outset around what's the context for net community benefit, probably what a lot of you already know in terms of where it sits in the planning scheme, but also how reviews have considered net community benefit, in particular the Auditor General's review. John's then going to take you through some key VCAT decisions that have considered net community benefit, and we're going to move towards a discussion around why we shouldn't necessarily strive to develop a defined methodology for a net community benefit assessment and what factors you still might need to be mindful of in considering net community benefit. This webinar is interactive. We'll have time at the end for questions and answers. So please, as we're going through the seminar today, there is a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to pop any questions you might have within that question box, and we'll aim to have around 10 minutes or so at the end for questions to answer anything you might have. So just by way of introduction, here's our natural starting point, and that's looking at clause 7102-3, which talks about integrated decision making in our planning schemes. And if you're familiar with this part of the scheme, you're probably very familiar with the term net community benefit. The way this clause has been designed, and certainly the way in which it's applied in decision making, is that it is increasingly all pervasive throughout planning decision making. It tells us that planning and responsible authorities should endeavour to integrate the range of planning policies relevant to the issues to be determined and to balance conflicting objectives in favour of net community benefit and sustainable development for present and future generations. Of course, there's an identification that in bushfire areas, bushfire policy must be prioritised over all other policy considerations to protect human life. As I touched on, this sits within the operational part of the planning scheme, and it moved from clause 10.04 of the planning scheme as part of Amendment VC 148 a couple of years ago. And you might think that that's just shifting the furniture from one part of the scheme to another part of the scheme, but I think the change is a little bit more significant than that, because by putting it in the operational provisions, it's become much clearer in terms of how this clause is supposed to be applied and to operate. It becomes clearer that this is an instruction on how you should apply the planning scheme to a proposal when you're undertaking an assessment. It's an operational requirement and a fundamental consideration that we're supposed to be demonstrating in all of our decision making, both on planning permit applications and also planning scheme amendments. that then leads into the tension that we'd like to talk about in this webinar today, which is that it's all well and good to have this instruction, but how do we know that a proposal achieves net community benefit? How do we define it? Of course, net community benefit is not defined within our planning scheme, and that's something John's going to return to in his discussion a little bit later. And you've probably written or read many planning reports that have claimed that a proposal will achieve a net community benefit. But in what way does it achieve a net community benefit? And other than a line at the end of the report that says that the proposal does so, what's formed that conclusion? What analysis has been demonstrated? And I think you've probably all seen to varying degrees in some of these reports that the methodology that's been used to inform that assessment has been variable. In some cases demonstrated well, in some cases not so well, and they might have used different considerations in informing their net community benefit assessment. Net community benefit is not a new concept, and that's something that I think is worth reinforcing, that it's probably something we're giving more credence to in decision making, particularly over the last few years, but it's been part of our planning scheme since the new format planning schemes were first introduced. And the extract I've got up on the slide here is the statement that used to sit at clause 11, which was the introduction to the SPPF. And the goal was for the SPPF to ensure that the objectives of planning were fostered through appropriate policies and practices which integrated social, economic and environmental matters in the interests of net community benefit and sustainable development. Probably sounds familiar to you because that's the goal of planning schemes today, and that's still what's set out in the purpose of the PPF at clause 7102 and is then reflected in the integrated decision making section of the planning scheme as well. And you can see from the first paragraph, it uses language which is very similar to the language that we've got in the planning scheme today. But as you work through the subsequent paragraphs here, and also in what used to be clauses 12 and 13, you can see that the planning scheme used to be more directive in its approach. It recognised in these paragraphs that there is a more direct relationship to the objectives of the Act, and particularly to the first objective of the Act, which is to provide for the fair, orderly, economic and sustainable use and development of land. And it becomes very clear from that that there's a link between what is being sought to be achieved by the net community benefit test and the objectives of the Act. The state planning policy framework as it then was, and now the planning policy framework, is meant to be an expression of how the objectives of the Act can be achieved in the advancement of policy, both at a strategic level and at a statutory level as well. So when we think about whether we are achieving a net community benefit in assessing an application, it is of course within the context of these objectives. And all of them are relevant in that assessment. And we'll think particularly about objectives A and G in a moment. But when we look at some of the objectives that sit within the middle here, they're all matters that we might look to balance against each other when we make our decision. We might consider the extent to which a proposal provides for the protection of natural and man-made resources. We might look to consider the extent to which we've conserved and enhanced buildings which are identified as being of historical significance, or the extent to which we provide for affordable housing. Those are things which we might balance in our decision making and recognise that we might be having negative consequences against some of those objectives. Whereas when we look at objectives A and G, these are really our fundamental principles for planning. As planners, we're constantly trying to achieve the fair, orderly, economic and sustainable use and development of land, and to balance the present and future interests of all Victorians. Sometimes though, I think as planners, we can scupper how we deal with these objectives because we can suffer from short-termism in the way we look at proposals and don't necessarily consider the interests of future Victorians or in relation to objective A and the economic development of land, we might develop land in a way that is uneconomic, or we don't consider the full extent of economic considerations, economic to the landowner, to other parties, to the community, etc., etc. And of course, it's clear from both the Act and the planning scheme that net community benefits something that must be considered by all planning and responsible authorities. But I just want to pause on this slide for a moment to acknowledge that there is a bit of a stronger framework for how you might assess it in dealing with planning scheme amendments rather than planning permit applications. And the strategic assessment guidelines require a planning authority to identify whether an amendment will have a net community benefit and specifically do what is essentially a cost benefit analysis of the amendment. And the guidelines also ask a planning authority that in considering whether the amendment would have social, economic or environmental effects, that there is essentially a net community benefit analysis that is being undertaken. So do we know how to consider net community benefit in decision making? Well, I think the short answer is no, and that's not just my view, it's a conclusion that the Auditor General made in his audit of the Victorian planning system in 2016. And his view was that there was limited assurance that planning decisions were delivering net community benefit and sustainable development. And I find the reflections of VAGO, or the Victorian Auditor General's Office, interesting because it acknowledges that there's no specific guidance around what net community benefit is and how it might be applied in assessing amendments and applications. It does say that there is more evidence of its consideration in dealing with gaming and out-of-centre development, and certainly if you do a broad search of VCAT case law, you'll find that it's considered extensively for gaming proposals, but less so for most other proposals unless they are of state or regional significance and require a balancing of localised negative impacts, as a for instance. In the Auditor General's view, the test for net community benefit is that it should address the full spectrum of positive and negative environmental, social and economic impacts of a proposal. That, in the Auditor General's view, is fundamentally the net community benefit test. And when it considered that against a range of files that it audited from the councils that were subject to the audit and from the State Planning Department itself, it found that very few amendment and permit assessments stated or assessed whether a proposal would provide a net community benefit. The next point is that there was an interesting observation that a key weakness of planning assessment reports was that there was a very narrow focus on particular physical amenity concerns of a proposal to the detriment of broader public interest and community benefit concerns. And this is something that John and I, in our work when we do council audits from time to time, is something that does bear itself out in delegate reports, that delegate reports are a fundamental documentation of the process you've undertaken to make your decision. And there is often a key focus on particular issues that might have been raised in objections or the like. But there is a need to demonstrate in your assessment that you have considered the full range of considerations, including whether you've achieved a net community benefit in your decision making. So the question then is, how do we move towards an appropriate way to ensure we consider net community benefit in our assessments? And John's going to take you through that next, both through a consideration of VCAT case law and also some of the context around net community benefit decision making.
Thanks, Matt. Some interesting comments there made by the Auditor General, I thought too, and I think we often find this, it's when you do the file audits, maybe the assessment has actually been done, but it's not necessarily documented. And so you wonder whether it's an assessment issue or a reporting issue. Maybe it's a bit of both. But I thought that the comments in the auditor's report too, Matt, about looking at sort of a focus on the physical impacts of a proposal rather than the broader community impact was an interesting one, and is perhaps telling about the way that we as statutory planners are inexorably drawn towards things like off-site amenity impacts, almost to the exclusion of all other factors. So what do we mean by net community benefit? Clearly, as Matt said, there's no definition in the planning scheme, but that doesn't mean that the term itself is inherently meaningless. And of course, we should recognise that Clause 73 of all planning schemes says that a term that is not defined has its ordinary meaning. When we're doing a net community benefit analysis as planners and as decision makers in this system, what we're really doing is that we are looking at the benefits or pros of a particular proposal or outcome to the community and whether or not they outweigh any identified disbenefits or cons arising from a proposal to the community. And that's perhaps essentially what we might consider to be synonymous with good planning. Now, what the auditor said, and I think what we would agree as practitioners, is that decision makers really need to consider the benefits and disbenefits of a proposal, balance and weigh them, and then decide on which side of the ledger the proposal falls. That is to say, should it be supported or should it be opposed? Now, importantly, what the courts have said, and I think what the Tribunal said as well, is that net community benefit can still be established even when a proposal is contrary to a relevant planning provision and or results in detrimental impacts. So we're not, as I'm sure you've heard people like me say from time to time, we're not interested in the pursuit of ideal or optimal outcomes. The test, of course, really is around acceptable ones. Now, when we're doing that analysis, though, it needs to be demonstrated that these disbenefits are outweighed by other benefits associated with the proposal. Now, like so many other things of our planning schemes, the architecture of the VPP supports a net community benefit approach, and that's really because the VPP creates decision-making silos, which result often in multiple triggers. And so on that screen there, you could imagine a proposal. First silo might be settlement policy, the second might be heritage policy, the third might be environmental sustainability policy, the fourth might be transport policy, so on and so forth. At the back of it, we might have permits that might be triggered under the zone. We'll consider those in that silo. Then the overlay, there might be a particular provision or two. And at the end of that sort of decision matrix, you could be left with a series of yeses and nos that leave decision makers in somewhat of a quandary as to what the appropriate decision making should be. That's because the VPP contains layers of policy, and oftentimes those policies might conflict with each other, and tension between those policy settings is likely to regularly occur in our assessment. Now, as I said before, the planning system does not call for ideal or perfect outcomes. Rather, it requires acceptable outcomes based on a balance of relevant and sometimes competing town planning objectives, and the principles of net community benefit and sustainable development for the benefit of current and future generations is key to that informing that decision. So in a literal sense then, net community benefit means when the benefits arising from a proposal to the community outweigh any identified disbenefits arising from the proposal to the community. In other words, decision makers must consider the benefits and disbenefits of a proposal, balance and weigh them, and decide on which side of the ledger the proposal falls. Now, as we said before, that might still lead to a situation where the proposal may have negative or detrimental impacts, but overall it might be considered to be acceptable because the balancing act that we've undertaken leads us to form the view that a net community benefit has been achieved. Confused yet? Well, fair enough. It's a bit like neighbourhood character, isn't it? In some respects, this is a sort of an ideological proposition that the planning scheme is challenging us to understand. But we might understand net community benefit better by understanding these key decision-making principles within a VPP framework. And firstly, one of those principles is that an interpretation, when we're looking at policy or content of a VPP scheme, our principle would be that an interpretation that promotes the purpose or object of the act or scheme should be preferred over an interpretation that would not. Secondly, words and phrases must always be interpreted in context. You know, what is the context within which we're looking at this net community benefit analysis? Planning schemes are imprecise beasts in some respects, and we need to recognise that planning schemes are drafted by planners and are to be used by planners. And I say that with the greatest of respect to my legal friends when they're seeking to unpack meaning in our drafting, particularly around policy. It is, of course, critical to differentiate between a control that might have a requirement versus a policy. And of course, lastly, the policies that we consider when they're informing our discretion are not mandatory. Policy must be applied judiciously and must always be balanced against other policies of the planning scheme. Now, this concept of net community benefit, as Matt said, has been around now for a while. Certainly, it's been a key component of the VPP for at least the last decade, Matt, if not longer. I'm not sure when that extract of the VPP you put up before was published. When was that? How long ago was that?
1997, John.
Golly. Well, as I'm frequently reminded in my training sessions by my audience, 1997 was a long time ago. For me, it was sort of the start of my career, but for some of you, it might have been close to the start of your life. So it's been around for a while, huh? So Matt has already mentioned that the objectives of the Planning Environment Act, and in particular objectives A and G at Section 4 of the Act, really set out what we consider to be those sort of foundational aspects of what planning is seeking to achieve. And we would say that those objectives are inherently consistent with the framework that a net community benefit analysis is seeking to achieve. The net community benefit type analysis is also consistent with the way we, in broad compass, seek to develop and implement public policy aims more broadly. And Matt and I would certainly be of the view that the application of a net community benefit to a town planning assessment, whether that's the assessment of a planning permit application or a planning scheme amendment, is really consistent with that sort of Calder-Hicks rule of public policy making. And that Calder-Hicks rule really says that a decision or policy will be more efficient for the society if the gain in welfare by the beneficiaries is greater than the loss in welfare for those adversely affected. In other words, say, a regulatory initiative like a planning scheme amendment would be warranted if the beneficiaries could, if required, compensate those adversely affected and still be better off. This is essentially where this idea of net community benefit comes from in a planning decision-making framework. Now, really, whether that compensation is actually paid is really immaterial for the purposes of public policy making. That's quite different than the Pareto test. The Pareto test, on the other hand, says that an initiative is only warranted if there are no losers in the process. That is to say that social change, regulatory change, or policy change in a planning scheme would only be possible if at least one person is made better off and no one is made worse off. Now, I think the strategic planners among us would definitely agree that if the Pareto test was the principle that we were to follow in terms of planning scheme amendments, it would be an impossible test for us to pass, and it would probably mean no change in planning schemes or policy. Now, Importantly too, net community benefit is not a formula. So it's not a cost benefit analysis. Now you might see a number of these CBAs prepared by economists to support a planning scheme amendment. But it's important, I think, for us to understand that a cost benefit analysis is really there to support a net community benefit analysis. It is not a substitute for one. And that's because town planning often leads to is often directed towards the achievement of both tangible and intangible benefits. So we might be assisted by an economic analysis, which might purport to establish a series of tangible benefits. But really the presence or absence of those benefits is not the defining test that we would use in a net community benefit analysis. Now, whilst an economic analysis might seek to establish or perhaps might seek to quantify a benefit or lack of benefit, many other planning outcomes are more nebulous. So we might understand, for example, that creating more housing is typically understood to be a benefit, and we often understand too that more jobs, not less, is a better outcome for society. However, other planning benefits are less measurable, aren't they? So how would one measure the benefit, in inverted commas, of good planning? How would one quantify the benefit of implementing a strategic plan or developing a building that delivers a good urban design outcome? Now, we might try to establish an economic framework to flesh some of those benefits out, and I've seen that done, and economics firms like SGS Economics and Planning are regularly engaged to do that sort of work. But really those sort of, economic quantifications of benefit are really there to inform a net community benefit, not define a net community benefit. The following cases that I'm going to run you through now really seek to establish how the Tribunal has grappled with this term. So the four cases that we're going to look at are the Supreme Court decision of Rosen and the Macedon Ranges Shire Council, and the next three are VCAT decisions, the University of Melbourne versus the Minister of Planning, Myers Planning Group and Warrnambool, and SMA projects, and Stonington City Council. So what you'll see when we go through these cases really is the wide variety of circumstances where a net community benefit analysis was sought to be applied by the decision maker, whether it was the primarily the Tribunal in this case. And in my view too, these cases really demonstrate the futility in trying to define, in a regulatory way at least, a framework for a net community benefit analysis. So the first decision is that of Rosen and the Macedon Ranges Shire. It's a decision of the Victorian Supreme Court, and it was a case that was appealed by the proponent to the Supreme Court, challenging the decision of the Tribunal to only approve one dwelling on a parcel of land instead of two in an open potable water supply catchment area in the Macedon Ranges Shire Council. Now, what Rosen really demonstrates is that a net community benefit is informed by the facts of a particular case. It's not fixed by the planning scheme and is essentially a matter for the decision maker. And that's borne out in paragraph 172 of the Supreme Court decision, which you can see on the screen before you at the moment. In this particular case, the benefits of the proposal that were advanced by the Rosens were that allowing dwellings on the land would assist in implementing a revegetation or management plan that would be certain to achieve certain environmental benefits. And the applicant was saying that those benefits would be consistent with various aspects of planning policy. they said that the benefits that the application would create needed to be balanced against the alleged risk of detriment to water quality, and that the additional risk that two dwellings on the land might cause. The Tribunal said, well, I think the court said, pardon me, that they did not accept that argument, or that the benefit outweighed the cost, and that the Tribunal had committed an error, and it said that we agree that the planning scheme acknowledges the opportunity, the Tribunal said we agree that the planning scheme acknowledges the opportunity to use the grant of a permit for a dwelling as the catalyst for achieving positive environmental outcomes, but when evaluating the positive environmental outcomes that may result from allowing one or two dwellings on this land, we have concluded that the greater chance of success and long-term improvements will result if the land is retained in a single holding and managed as a single unit. And the court effectively upheld that decision in its decision. The next case is that of the University of Melbourne versus the Minister for Planning. It's a 2011 case. 3 images on the page at the moment show the Ampol building on the corner of Elizabeth Street up near the Haymarket roundabout there in its heyday. The middle image is what it was like more or less at the time that the application was made, and the third image is the building that was proposed for the site. Now, what was proposed here was that the University of Melbourne was seeking to establish the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity on the subject land as a world-class biomedical facility specialising in human infectious diseases and immunity. Now, the institute was a partnership between the University of Melbourne, the Victorian Government and Melbourne Health, and it sought to bring together major organisational groups that were recognised as leaders in their field. The units were to include the University of Melbourne, the Victorian Infectious Disease Service, the Nossal Institute for Global Health, among various other organisations. It was underpinned by a $90 million grant by the Commonwealth Government to build this building on the subject land. And it had to go on this site because of its locational attributes, proximity to Melbourne University, important Melbourne hospitals, and the fact that it was in a precinct identified for this type of activity. So the Tribunal said that the benefits that will flow from the location of the establishment of the institute in this location are undisputed. It went on to say, however, to build the purpose-designed facility with the funding agreement with the Commonwealth envisages the existing heritage building on site must be demolished. So the former Ampol house, which you can see on the right there, was an 8-storey office building in reinforced concrete, a handsome specimen in its heyday, obviously. Architecturally, it was notable principally for its dramatically glazed circular corner tower housing Melbourne's tallest concrete spiral stair. It was completed in 1957. Now, there was obviously strong policy support in the planning scheme for the retention of this heritage asset, but equally there was strong policy support for the establishment of the research and education facility, such as the Peter Doherty Institute within the precinct. The dilemma facing the Tribunal was that the achievement of each of these planning objectives was mutually exclusive. The Peter Doherty Institute required a purpose-built building, and it was just simply not possible to adapt the former Ampol house to its need. So the stark choice was to either retain the Ampol building and lose the Peter Doherty Institute, or to lose this heritage building through demolition. Tribunal went through those costs and benefits and talked about the test being one of acceptable outcomes, and obviously identified that the retention of the heritage asset was a strong community benefit, but so too was the establishment of the Peter Doherty Institute on the subject land. Either way, one part of the planning scheme was going to be offended if this proposal did or did not go ahead. The question for the tribunal was which side of the policy ledger did this proposal fall within. So the tribunal said, sort of artistically in some respects, that cities must be regarded as palimpsests. So I, of course, had no idea what the word palimpsest meant. So I looked it up, and it means that a palimpsest is something reused or altered but still bearing visible traces of its earlier form. The tribunal ended up approving the Peter Doherty Institute. Now, Peter Doherty Institute has just recently celebrated its 5th anniversary in September 2019. So in fact, it's probably celebrated its 6th anniversary, given that we're in November 2020. Well, pleasingly, that decision was made because, you know what? The Peter Doherty Institute has played a leading role in Australia's response to the novel coronavirus, and the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes the disease COVID-19, of course, has changed life as we know it, probably irrevocably, and here we are all working from home as a consequence of that. On Tuesday, 28th of January, only a few days after diagnosing Victoria's first positive COVID-19 case, the Doherty Institute confirmed that they had successfully grown the virus in cell culture in the laboratory, and it was the first institute to grow the virus outside of China and share it with the World Health Organization and public health laboratories across the world. With access to the virus, researchers could not only validate test results, but also commence work on better diagnostic tests, treatments, and a vaccine. The Doherty Institute was conceived and purpose-built to respond to a pandemic. I reckon, Matt, what do you reckon? The Tribunal got it right?
Yeah, it's something that I guess couldn't have been foreshadowed in terms of the benefit that would arise, but it's clearly been very beneficial.
Thanks, Matt. So obviously not all net community benefit tests are so obvious. The next one we want to take you to is Myers Planning Group and Warrnambool Shire Council. Of course, if anyone would like copies of these decisions, feel free to reach out to us on the chat and we'll make sure you get them. In Myers Planning Group, I think one of our participants today is from the Myers Planning Group, so welcome to you. This was a case where a planning permit was lodged for a drug and rehabilitation centre. It was planned in Dennington, which is a suburb of Warrnambool, on rural land. Now, in this case, this issue of planning need, was considered by the Tribunal, and the benefits and disbenefits of the proposal were considered. What was, I think, relevant in this case is what is the community? And of course, what is the scale on which we might determine how a community benefit or disbenefit is calculated? So in this case, the Tribunal looked at need and it said, well, there's clearly a need for this residential alcohol and drug rehabilitation centre in Western Victoria. It's quite different to the arguments put forward for the Doherty Institute, where it had to go on that particular site, given its locational attributes. This centre could have gone on another site. So in this case, the Tribunal sort of distinguished this case from, say, the Alfred Hospital helipad case, and it said that need was not a compelling factor in the same way that it would have been, that it was for, say, the hospital helipad. The Tribunal said that it still needed to be satisfied in this case that the proposal was consistent with the farming zone that it was to be located in, having regard to the purpose, decision guidelines of the zone itself and any other policy settings for agriculture and community health related services. And so it weighed up the benefits and disbenefits of this proposal. Now, in this particular proposal, I think it raised issues such as, well, what is the community? Is the community the local community of Dennington? Is the community the community of the city, the rural city of Warrnambool? Is it the community of Southwest Victoria? And clearly that argument would could be made different, well, was made differently depending on which side of the fence you sat on. Obviously, if you're a resident of Dennington, then you might have a particular view about which community is more important. But it does raise issues too, I think, about what the scale of the benefit might be versus the scale of the local disbenefit. The next case is that of SMA projects in Stonington. I gave evidence for the Stonington City Council in this case, and it involved a mixed-use apartment complex to be built over the airspace above a railway line with an abuttal to Chapel Street. So it was down the Pran end of the Chapel Street activity centre. And in this case, the Tribunal looked at a variety of benefits that were purported to accrue from this development in making its decision. One of those was that as a consequence of developing over the airspace, the applicant had negotiated that it would pay VicTrack a sum of $4.5 million towards, a sum of $4.5 million for its ability to build over the air rights. And the Tribunal said that this payment for air rights can be considered a community benefit, even though that community benefit would be unlikely to accrue locally. That is to say, the money that would be paid to VicTrack was unlikely to be spent in the vicinity of the Chapel Street activity centre, but would go into a pool through which VicTrack would apportion that money towards rail improvements for the benefit of the state of Victoria. And that was a point acknowledged in the applicant's, permit applicant's evidence presented by Ms. Jordan. Now, Matt, you're going to talk now about how a panel's looked at net community benefit.
Yeah, thanks, John. So John's touched on some key VCAT decisions around net community benefit and the Supreme Court decision in Rosen as well. I think it's also interesting to look at the way panels have considered net community benefit too. This is the panel report for Hume C154, and there were various submissions put to the panel around whether a net community benefit would be achieved by the planning scheme amendment or not. And I don't want to necessarily dwell on the individual issues of this case, but more take the logic that follows from the panel around how you might consider net community benefit. And like many of the VCAT cases that have been advanced in this presentation and many more, there's an acknowledgement that there is no magic formula to determining net community benefit. And the panel found in this case that it needs to assess whether the community will be better off rather than the individuals, and that some individuals may be adversely affected. And this effectively goes to the link that John was talking around with the Calder-Hicks test. It's also acknowledged within the panel discussion that you can make an assessment of whether or not you achieve a net community benefit based on inconclusive evidence or conflicting submissions that might be before you. So you don't need to have necessarily a conclusive position that's advanced in evidence, but rather that you need to be able to establish that on the best evidence that's available to you, something would result in a net community benefit or not, in order to develop a framework for making a decision on whether net community benefit is achieved or not. That then leads us into this next discussion point, really around why the planning scheme might not necessarily need to go any further in net community benefit. And I'm going to hand back to John to just touch on these points to start off with, but just a reminder, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat because we're about to head towards question time too.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, look, when I began conceiving this webinar session, I actually thought the opposite. I thought, well, maybe actually there's too much, there's not enough direction provided by the planning scheme in assisting planners to exercise their discretion around NCB tests. But having done the research, I actually formed the other view that in fact there is real merit in the planning scheme's current approach, which is to apply and give great latitude to decision makers in exercising their discretion under a net community benefit framework. I think the Peter Doherty Institute is a classic case in that. I mean, who could ever have conceived that the incredible benefits that would have flowed to the Victorian state and indeed nation from the establishment of that centre on that land. Of course, too, you know, it's hard to define good ideas and good outcomes ahead of time, isn't it? And the Doherty Institute case, I think, is a salient reminder of that to all of us. So, planners, you know, some of us have got necessarily come from a basis where we'd like to see more words in planning schemes, not less, more certainty around decision making, not less. But I think the flexibility that we see in the NCB provision at the moment is actually a desirable attribute of the Victorian system. And that's because planning is not merely a series of financial accounts. We're not really adding it up in a dollars and cents type of way, or a jobs made versus jobs lost way, for instance. But there will be a number of intangible benefits that planning might seek to deliver, and they resist, I think, you know, that sort of numerical approach to benefit identification and evaluation. As I said before, how would you quantify the value of good planning, or how would you quantify the consistent application of a structure plan over time? I mean, there's clearly a benefit in it, otherwise we wouldn't do it. Correct, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's right, John. And I think, you know, the point that's on the third dot point here, that it's not merely a series of financial accounts, is pretty imperative to think about too. Certainly cost-benefit analysis can inform a net community benefit assessment, but it's not the whole story. And as you say, there are more qualitative indicators that need to be considered in your net community benefit analysis as well. Yeah.
So some things to think about later, maybe after today's session. Probably fair to say that the types of benefits that you would consider in your assessment is relative to the case before you. Sometimes a proposal will have more localised benefits or disbenefits. Some, of course, as we've seen in the cases before us today, the benefits are more regional or national even. And I think it would be fair to say that if a proposal was to deliver those sorts of benefits, that would count more towards its support, particularly if the negative impacts were of a more localised nature. The scale of a project and its catchment can certainly help in defining the nature of the impact, both benefits and disbenefits. And I think the Myers case in Dennington is an example of that proposition. You might ask yourself, really, are the benefits local, regional, state, or does it matter? And what we've seen from some of those cases before us is that there is no single community in a community benefit assessment. That is to say, there might be multiple communities that we might have regard to. Matt?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think that community is fragmented in terms of the existing community, but we've also got to think about a community that might not have a voice in the decision making too, which is a future community too. And I think sometimes some of the analysis that occurs by virtue of objections and submissions is focusing very strongly on an existing community, and going back to the Auditor General's report, maybe balances our consideration in decision making more against a consideration of a future community, or the way in which our decision making will influence that future community particularly as well.
Might hand over to some questions. We've got a few on the chat.
Yeah. We've got one so we've got some in the question and answer section and some in the chat. We've got one I'm really interested in here, John, is a question from Nikki, which is, how can net community benefit best be considered when a referral authority assesses an application on a matter? And so they look at it from a silo perspective of their specialist expertise, but they've got veto rights on the application. They're able to require conditions on a permit, and that veto ability can prevent appropriate weighing up of competing factors. And the example that's given is floodplain management, where the floodplain management authority might require development to raise floor levels in a flood affected area to mitigate flood risk. But doing so means urban design outcomes that are compromised because they're more difficult to achieve active street frontages, for instance. Whose role is it to weigh up those competing objectives, and how can it be done?
Well, I guess it will ultimately be the role of the Tribunal on appeal if that's where it ends up. Nikki, Matt and I have just been working on a project which is currently before an advisory committee, which was a permit that was called in a flood affected area down in the southeast of the state. And that decision, when it comes out, I think will examine precisely the question that you've raised, and that was a question that was an issue that involved a hotel development on the shores of Lake Wellington, deep within a floodplain, and arguments around the benefit that was accruing from the hotel would outweigh the negative impacts of it being within a floodplain. Now, I'm not going to comment on that because the advisory committee is still deciding that matter. I think it probably would be inappropriate for me to enter into that. But Matt, did you want to talk generally about that proposition?
I think, and there's another question that's come up, which is how will the approach to net community benefit assessment be if we put climate change impacts in the mix as well? And that's something that's very much a live issue in the advisory committee issue that John's talking around as well. And it's something that I think is challenging to put a decent enough consideration on at the moment in terms of the information we have available to us. But certainly there's policy there that requires a balancing, particularly in relation to climate change. And I think the challenge, particularly in relation to that climate change aspect, is ensuring that floodplain managers are doing, and catchment management authorities are doing enough modelling now to ensure that they understand the impact of 2100 flood events, which is what's required by policy in particular as well.
And Nikki, I think too the Act now requires referral authorities in making their decision to have regard to the planning policy framework, doesn't it, Matt?
It does, yep.
So they're no longer really able to just make a decision that is not cognizant of those broader planning objectives, and that's something I think that referral authorities are more frequently now turning their minds to. And a good example of that, I think, is the Department of Transport, particularly in relation to the way they are seeking to implement the Transport Integration Act objectives, Matt, aren't they? Which yep. Effectively, and I don't think this is accidental, call for an almost parallel integrated decision-making process to be undertaken by DOT when they're making decisions about things like planning permit referrals or infrastructure upgrades and those types of things. So that issue of an integrated decision-making approach that Clause 71023 requires is actually being pursued now by many referral authorities. Whether that's deliberate, accidental, it's certainly occurring.
There's a question here, John, that I think goes to scale, which is that Section 60 of the Act requires responsible authorities to consider significant social impacts and effects, and the changes to the Act now say that in considering a significant social effect, you need to consider the number of objectors in determining that effect. The comment is that it can sometimes be difficult to determine what is good for the community, even if the community themselves think otherwise. And there's a question as to what are your thoughts and what's a concept for the greater good in those kind of circumstances?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think this goes really to the agency of the planner and what scope we value and the input of the planner. I think this all dates back, doesn't it, Matt, to Jane Jacobs and the Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she basically just said, I think there was a real reaction to her book when it was released, and it was highly critical of the agency of the planner as decision maker. And that probably said more about the sorts of decisions that planners were making at the time, rather as much as it said about the need to involve the community. And I think what you've seen over since the release of Jacob's book is that planners have perhaps miscalibrated the role that the community has in the decision-making framework, and that is to say that they're an input to the decision, but they are not the decision. And I think really that's what the Act is saying, that of course you'd have regard to objectors and the number of objectors if there were many, but that doesn't mean that it's a popularity contest. And quite frankly, planning decision making isn't a democratic process. And I think the net community benefit test is a reflection of that approach, right? So what we're really looking at doing is balancing the interests of current or present and future generations. That's a requirement of the Act. So how does one, so if we believe in the agency of the planner, then the agency of the planner is really looking at both the views and needs of the current population, but also that of the population that isn't there yet. And so I think tribunals quite rightly have had regard to the numbers of objections, but they haven't found it to be determinative in their decision making.
The question here around whether there's any thoughts on bushfire trumping everything else as part of the net community benefit test, and it's an interesting question because as John and I were preparing for this course, we were wanting to put in a decision around this issue, but in the interest of time, we ran out of room to put it in. But it's a good question, and I think probably there are VCAT cases which deal with this, and I think if we're sending out some of the other VCAT cases, we might include a decision which John and I have reviewed, which I think doesn't necessarily paint a picture that you would grant a permit that prioritises life and meets the bushfire test, but also achieves negative outcomes in terms of other policy considerations. That yes, the net community benefit test is telling you that you must prioritise the protection of life, but there might still be reasons as to which granting a permit might be unacceptable because it doesn't achieve other social, environmental, economic policy that's sought to be achieved within the planning scheme or by the objectives of the Act. And the case we refer to is dealing with the protection of waterway vegetation versus the defendable space requirements for bushfire. And I think what the tribunal found in that particular case was that, well, the fact that it does need to provide defendable space, and the fact that that compromises the waterway values might still be a reason to refuse the permit application because it's not achieving policy that's seeking to protect waterways, for instance.
Well done, Matt. Thanks everybody for your questions, and I hope we've done justice to them in our answers. We're going to just wrap up in just a moment, but just a word from our sponsor. So ADDO has not gone in. I know, check out our 2021 core training calendar. Now, we haven't gone into the fitness business. We're not really talking about, doing crunches here, but really this is our core training is core skills for us as a profession. So check out our 2021 program. There's a lot of really interesting courses for you to participate in next year. We're going to stay online. Hopefully we might get back into the classroom at some stage. Public health requirements and all of those sorts of things are pending, but we'd really look forward to seeing you at some of those courses next year. I think the next one that we've got this year is on landscape assessment. It's got Steve Shutt running it and one of his colleagues. That'll be an excellent one for anybody who's got a role in assessing landscape plans or providing advice to applicants on that topic. It'd be an excellent half-day session. I'd really recommend you have a look at it. Matt, anything further from you?
The only thing for me is to say thank you all for attending today and your participation. There's been plenty of questions, plenty of comments in the chat. We will follow up with a copy of the VCAT decisions for those that are interested, including the one we mentioned on waterways and bushfire. This is a really interesting topic, and I've certainly appreciated any opinions that you've expressed to us in the chat as well.
Thanks, Matt, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one of these. We'll continue to hold them throughout the public health sort of crisis that we're in at the moment, and probably later, because they're really fun to do and we enjoy delivering them. So thanks so much for participating, and good morning to you all.
Thanks, everybody.